cerebellum. Now, functions of the cerebellum. They are frequently asked in exams that what are the different functions of cerebellum. The vestibular cerebellum, the small flocculo-nodular lobes, they provide neuronal circuits for most of the body's equilibrium movements. The Spinocerebellum, vermis, of the posterior and anterior cerebellum plus the adjacent intermediate zones on both sides of the vermis provides the circuitry for coordinating mainly the movements of distal portions of the limbs, especially hands and fingers. The Cerebro Cerebellum, the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemispheres, lateral to intermediate zones, they receive input from the cerebral motor cortex and adjacent premotor and somatosensory cortices of the cerebellum. It transmits its output information in the upward direction back to the brain, functioning in a feedback manner with the cerebral cortices, sensory motor system, to plan sequential voluntary movement of the body and limbs. They plan these as much as the 10th of a second in advance of the actual movements. Now let's talk about them in detail. Now, what is this term vestibulocerebellum? Now, what is vestibulocerebellum? It provides neural circuits for most of the body's equilibrium movements. It controls the balance between agonist and antagonist muscle contractions of the spine, hips, and shoulders during rapid changes in body positions as required by vestibular apparatus. During control of equilibrium, it is presumed that information from both the body periphery and the vestibular apparatus is used in a typical feedback control circuit to provide anticipatory correction of postural motor signals necessary for maintaining equilibrium even during extremely rapid motion, including rapidly changing directions of the motion. Then we should be knowing about the spinocerebellum. Now, what is this term? Spinocerebellum. It is connected with spinal cord. It provides the circuitry for coordinating mainly movements of the distal portions of limbs, especially the hands and fingers. This consists of most of the vermis and intermediate zones. The intermediate zone of each cerebellar hemisphere receives two types of information when a movement is performed, from the motor cortex and from the red nucleus, telling the cerebellum the intended sequential plan of movement for the next few fractions of a second. The feedback information from the peripheral parts of the body, from distal proprioceptors of the limbs, telling the cerebellum what actual movements result. After the intermediate zone of cerebellum has compared the intended movements with the actual movements, the deep nuclear cells of the interposed nucleus, they send corrective output signals back to cerebral motor cortex through relay nuclei in the thalamus to magnocellular portions of the red nucleus, the Rougarou spinal tract. This part of the cerebellar motor control system provides smooth, coordinated movements of agonist-antagonist muscles of the distal limbs for performing acute, purposeful, patterned movements. You can see how this whole process is going on. What is the circuitry of the cerebellum? How the whole process is going on? Now, cerebellum prevents the overshoot of movements and damp the movements. Almost all the body movements, they are pendular. That is, when the arm is moved, the momentum develops and the momentum must be overcome before the movement can be stopped. Now, because of the momentum, all pendular movements, they have a tendency to overshoot. The arm oscillates back and forth past its intended point for several cycles before it finally fixes on its mark. So this effect is known as the action tremors or intentional tremors if the cerebellum is damaged. So what is this term, action or intentional tremors? So one of the functions of cerebellum is the damping of the movements so that they are not pendular at all. There is no overshooting of the movements. If the cerebellum is intact, appropriate learned subconscious signals, they stop the movement precisely at the intended point, thereby preventing the overshoot and the tremor. So the damping of movement is occurring. Now the cerebellar control of ballistic movements. Now most rapid movements of the body, such as the movements of fingers in typing, occur so rapidly that it is not possible to receive the feedback information either from the periphery to the cerebellum or from the cerebellum back to the motor cortex before the movements are over. These movements are known as the ballistic movements. So this term ballistic movements is important. That ballistic movements, meaning that the entire movement is pre-planned and is set into motion to go a specific distance and then to stop. Now another important example is the saccadic movements of the eyes. Now what are the saccadic movements? In which the eyes, they jump from one position to the next when reading or when looking at successive points along a road as a person is moving in a car. In the absence of the cerebellar circuit, the motor cortex has to think extra hard to turn ballistic movements on and again has to think hard and take extra time to turn the movement off. Thus the automatization, which is the work of cerebellum, is lost. The automatism of ballistic movements is lost. Now Cerebro Cerebellum. The Cerebro Cerebellum is the function of the large lateral zone of cerebellar hemisphere, that is to plan, to sequence and to time the complex movements. This is consisting of large lateral zones of cerebellar hemispheres. It receives virtually all its input from the cerebral motor cortex and adjacent premotor and somatosensory cortices of the cerebellum, cerebrum. Now its output information, they go in the upward direction back to the brain, functioning in feedback manner with cerebral cortical sensory motor system to plan sequential voluntary body and limb movements, planning these as much as 1/10 of a second in advance of the actual movements. This is called development of motor imagery of movements to be performed. So what is motor imagery? Motor imagery is one of the functions of the Cerebro Cerebellum. Cerebro Cerebellum, the function of planning, the motor imagery. In human beings, the lateral zones of two cerebellar hemispheres, they are highly developed and greatly enlarged. Human abilities to plan and perform difficult sequential patterns of movement, especially with the hands and fingers, and to speak. The plan of sequential movements actually begins in the sensory and premotor areas of the cerebral cortex, and from there the plan is transmitted to the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemispheres. Now, many neurons in the cerebellar dentate nuclei, they display the activity pattern for the sequential movement that is yet to come while the present movement is still occurring. The lateral cerebellar zones appear to be involved not with what movement is happening at a given moment, but with what will be happening during the next sequential movement a fraction of a second or even seconds later. Ability to progress smoothly from one movement to the next is in orderly sequence. Cerebro Cerebellum timing, to provide appropriate timing for each subsequent movement. In the absence of lateral cerebellar zones, one loses the subconscious ability to predict ahead of time how far the different parts of the body will move in a given time. Person becomes unable to determine when the next sequential movement needs to begin. As a result, the subsequent movement may begin too early or too late. Lesions in the lateral zones of the cerebellum cause complex movements such as those required for writing, running, or talking to become incoordinate. Cerebro Cerebellum helps to time the events other than movements of the body. The rates of progression of both auditory and visual phenomena can be predicted by the brain, but both of these require cerebellar participation. A person can predict from the changing visual scene how rapidly he or she is approaching an object. Effects of removing the large lateral portions of the cerebellum in monkeys have shown that the monkeys are unable to predict when it will reach the wall. Now, the functions of cerebellum. The vestibular cerebellum has the function of equilibrium. The spinocerebellum has the function of damping action, comparator function, control of ballistic movements. Cerebro Cerebellum is having the function to plan, to sequence, and to time the complex movements. Now, when we are talking much about cerebellum, we should be knowing about the different abnormalities related to cerebellum, because frequently different scenarios related to disorders of cerebellum, they do come in paper. So we should be knowing the functional abnormalities of cerebellum. The destruction of small portions of lateral cerebellar cortex seldom causes detectable abnormalities in the motor function. Thus, the remaining portions of the motor control system are capable of compensating tremendously for the loss of parts of the cerebellum.